Hello, welcome to the EPG Pathshala program in Linguistics. I am Pramod Pandey, Center for Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Today we will be discussing Module 6 in the course Introduction to Phonetics and Phonology. Module 6 discusses the fourth important process of speech, namely the articulatory process. The articulatory process deals with the obstruction in the passage of the air stream in the vocal tract. The obstruction is of two kinds. One, the place where the obstruction is made, and the other, the degree of obstruction that is made. We have looked at the places of obstruction in the last module, and we'll look at with greater detail in a later module. But today, in this module, we will confine ourselves to the degrees of constriction which give rise to manners of articulation. There are various degrees of constriction or obstruction in the passage of the air stream, as we notice, giving rise to different types of sounds. For example, there is complete closure giving rise to plosives and stops, for example, ba, ga, ma, etc. The next degree is close approximation, that is, when the articulators do not completely close, but they come fairly close to each other, but leaving some space for air to escape. This gives rise to fricatives such as fa, etc. Partial closure, that means that the closure is not complete in the oral cavity, but is there only in part of the oral cavity. For example, when you say l, you have partial closure. Intermittent closure takes place when the articulators are closed for a very short period of time, and then they are open and then close again for a short period of time. So the degree of constriction is called intermittent closure. The closure here is not long enough for us to create any real obstruction in the passage of the air stream. The next stage degree of constriction is open approximation. This is found in sounds such as what we call semi-vowels and laterals. Here the articulators are put against each other, but there is not sufficient constriction to block the air from passing and to create any kind of noise. That's why these are called approximants. And then finally we have open air transition. This is found for production of vowels. So the speech articulators are quite open. Now, sounds are thus produced in mainly two main ways in terms of obstruction. One is the open transition, which gives rise to vowels, and the other is less open transitions with various degrees. Consonants are classified according to the different degrees of constriction. As we saw earlier, how human beings use the vocal cords, which have a certain physiological function, to produce so many different types of sounds, such as voiced, voiceless, aspirated, etc. What we find here is that given two articulators and the intention to block the airstream from passing, human beings make various degrees of constriction possible to give us so many different sounds, such as pa, and then fa, and then va, and then wa, and then ah. So all these sounds are different because of different degrees of constriction. Now, the different degrees of constriction which are used to distinguish the production of different types of vowels give rise to what is known as manners of articulation. The main manners of articulation that we are going to discuss are given on the screen: plosives, nasals, fricatives, affricates, trills, taps and flaps, laterals, and approximants. Apart from these specific terms giving us different classes of consonants, we also have some general terms used these days to distinguish different types of sounds. One very broad category of distinction apart from vowels and consonants is that of obstruents and sonorants. Obstruents are specifically consonants in the production of which there is a considerable degree of obstruction or constriction. The result is that there is unequal air pressure in the mouth and outside the mouth in the production of obstruents. Thus, when you say p, there is greater air pressure inside the mouth than outside the mouth. Same is the case with fricatives. When you are saying f, you have greater air pressure inside the mouth than outside the mouth. So plosives, fricatives, and affricates are obstruent sounds. These sounds have a specific property, namely that they have both voiceless and voiced counterparts. Compared to them, we have sonorant sounds. These sonorant sounds are those in the production of which the air pressure inside the mouth and outside the mouth is more or less equal. That is how some of these vowels and some of these consonants are found to be grouped together in certain processes. Let us turn to plosives. In the production of a plosive, there are three different stages: the contact stage, the hold stage, and then the release stage. Contact is when two articulators come into contact. They are held in complete closure state for a little while, so that the air is blocked from passing, the air pressure builds up, and then they are released. So the hold, and then the contact, and then release. When they are released, there is greater plosion. That is how sounds such as p or b or t is produced. Notice that if the hold is not long enough, then there is no plosive sound produced. Thus, when you say for a short while, there will be no plosion at all. Now, what we find is that of the three stages, namely contact, hold, and release, it is the hold stage which is the crucial amongst them. Depending on the occurrence of consonants, we may find that sometimes the release may not be taking place. For example, when we see words such as acting, then in the word acting, for the plosive k, there is no release as the articulators move from the production of k to t. T, however, is released. Similarly, we may have a consonant which is without any release. That's or a plosive without a release when it occurs, for example, at the end of words. So before another consonant or at the end of words, a consonant may not be released. The contact is sometimes not there in some situations. For example, when you have a p followed, a p occurring after a m, for example, in words such as simply. When you say simply, the lips come together for m, they are already there for m, so when it comes to the articulation of p, there is no coming together. Thus, only the hold stage for p is there and the release stage, but the contact stage is not there because it was there for the previous stages. Thus, for plosives, we have the hold stage, which is the most important. It is that stage which leads to the rise in the air pressure for the plosive type sounds to be produced. Take a look at some of these figures for the production of plosives. Sometimes plosive can have not a very clear oral release, but another kind of release, such as nasal release, like dna. So the is not clear straight away released, but it is sort of released with the nasal consonant, or it may be released with a lateral consonant, such as dl. So there are languages which have nasal or lateral release for certain sounds. Now, plosives from the bilabial position to the velar position can have 4 different laryngeal states normally, that is voiceless, unaspirated p, voiceless aspirated p, voiced unaspirated b, voiced aspirated or murmur or breathy sound such as bh. Most Indo-Aryan languages have these 4 laryngeal types, but there are languages which vary from 4 laryngeal types to a single laryngeal types as shown in the chart. Nasals. We have already described the production of nasal in the last module when we discussed oronasal process. Let us take a look at the figure which illustrates how a nasal consonant is produced. While most nasals are simple nasals, sometimes we can have modified nasals in different languages. For example, in some languages we have voiceless nasals, and in some other languages we have aspirated nasals. Thus, we have simple nasals, voiceless nasals, and aspirated nasals occurring as phonemes. As allophones, of course, you have so many other different possibilities depending on the context in which the phonemes appear. Fricatives. In the production of fricatives, the 2 articulators are brought into a contact of close approximation, as we said before. Because they are brought into a contact of close approximation, the air cannot pass out freely through them. When it passes, there is audible friction. Let's take a look at some of these figures for the production of fricatives. Among fricatives, you can have 2 types: those which are produced with less friction and noise, and others which are produced with more friction and noise. The ones which are produced with more friction and noise create a disturbance in the air particles and are generally known as strident fricatives. For example, s, z, sh, zh. These are strident fricatives compared to the fricatives f, v, h, g, f, v, etc. Acoustically, you can find out that the the pictures will show greater noise for sounds such as s, z, sh, zh, which are strident than for the sounds f, v, th, th, h, g, etc., which are less strident. We also have a kind of fricatives rarely found in languages called lateral fricatives. A lateral fricative is one which is produced with obstruction in the center of the mouth, but when the air passes out from the sides, unlike for L, lateral approximant, for lateral fricatives there is a greater constriction on the sides, and the sound thus produced is a lateral fricative. Affricates. Affricates are a manner of articulation that combine 2 different manners, namely plosive and fricative. They begin as plosives, and so they have the first 2 stages, namely the contact stage and a bit of hold stage together, which is what makes them share features with plosives. However, they differ from plosives and come closer to fricatives in the last stage, namely the release stage. When they are released, then the articulators do not separate suddenly as for plosives like p, b, but they separate slowly, so that when they separate, the sounds produced are like fricatives. For example, ts, z, ch, j, etc. So that is why the affricates are also called stops, and affricates, plosives and fricatives make one type of sound, namely obstruent sounds. Let's take a look at the figure for the production of affricates. Tap, trill and flap. They are put together because in most languages there is only one of them which is instantiated. Thus, if a language has a tap, it usually does not have a trill or a flap as a contrasting entity. Similarly, if it has a trill, then it does not have a tap as a contrastive unit, and so on. However, on close examination, you may find that that is not the case. Some languages distinguish a tap from a trill within the phonemic system. What is the difference between a tap and a trill and a flap? In the production of a tap, the tongue, the tip of the tongue makes a very momentary contact with the roof of the mouth and is brought back to its original place of rest. Thus we have sounds like ra, ra, where there is only one single contact by the tip of the tongue. In the production of a trill, there are several taps like rrr, rrr. So the tongue makes several contacts and to produce a trill. Now a flap is a sound in the production of which the tongue is curled back. So it makes a contact, momentary contact, but never stops, but sort of comes back to the original place. Now most flaps are retroflex flaps. The flaps are produced at the retroflex position. As you know, retroflex is a position where you also find retroflex stops like tada, retroflex nasals like na, and retroflex laterals like ra, and also retroflex flaps like ra. Retroflex flaps are commonly heard in many Indic languages. Approximants. Approximants are sounds in the production of which the articulators are held in the position of open approximation. This is the most open position that a production of a consonant can take. Beyond it, we have only vowels. There are two kinds of approximants. One is central approximant and the other is a lateral approximant. A central approximant is one in which the articulators are held in open approximation position, and in the center of the vocal tract, the sides are closed, and thus we have sounds such as wa, ya, etc., or ra produced. All these are examples of central approximants. In addition to central approximants, we have lateral approximants such as in the production of lateral approximants, there is a closure in the center of the mouth, but the sides are held in open approximant position so that we hear these lateral sounds. To summarize, in this module we have looked at the articulatory process. There are two aspects to it: places of articulation and manners of articulation. In this module we have focused on the manners of articulation and have tried to cover the discussion of the production of plosives, fricatives, affricates, nasals, taps, trills, and flaps, lateral approximants. With this, we come to the close of the discussion of manners of articulation. Thank you.